Scholastic Essay. How do you write one? Well, first, let's learn the 5 parts of a scholastic essay. You state the question in the first place, and I'm going to go through each of these in more detail, but just list them now. State of the question, and you want to state that question as precisely and as concisely as you can. The statement of the principal objections, then your thesis. And by the way, each of these objections in part number 2 will go contrary to your thesis, so you're going to be, in part 2, your own enemy. Try to think of the best arguments against your position. And in part 3, you're going to answer the question that you asked in part 1. You stated it here as a question, but here in part 3, you're going to give your thesis, in which case you're going to either affirm or deny that question that you gave in part 1. In part 4, you're going to give a few paragraphs defending your thesis. And in part 5, you're going to return to part 2 and refute those objections. Obviously, if any of those objections are not refuted, then those objections stand, and you'd need to change your thesis. Now, this is all a model of essay based upon what Thomas Aquinas did in his Summa Theologica. If you click this link right here, you can see how he did it. And this is a modification, then, of what Thomas Aquinas taught long ago. So let's look then in more detail at each of those parts. First of all, the statement of the question. And this statement will always begin with the word whether. And obviously it will always be a question. Here's an example. Whether seminary students should study systematic theology. So notice that this statement begins with whether, and that it is a question. And as always, when you choose your topic for your essay, you want to be careful that it's not too broad or too narrow. In part 2, we're going to state the principal objections to your thesis. And each of these objections must be a valid hypothetical syllogism. Now let me point out 2 things here. First of all, it is important that you think of the principal, that is the most important, the most cogent objections to your thesis. Anybody can go find weak objections to their thesis, or even make up their own objections and then easily throw them down. Sometimes in logic that's called the straw man fallacy. But here you want to be honest, since we're searching after the truth, not just looking to claim a victory. We want to find the best objections to our thesis. So, once you find them, you need to state these objections as a hypothetical syllogism. And if you are unclear as to what a hypothetical syllogism is, you can click this link here and learn about hypothetical syllogisms. And of course, that syllogism must be valid. Here then are the 2 premises of a objection I'm going to make to my thesis. And there's the conclusion. Now, when you look at this conclusion, you can immediately discern then what my thesis is going to be. Because if the objection is, therefore, seminary students should not study systematic theology, then you know my thesis is going to be seminary students should study systematic theology. And again, I will emphasize that you want to use the exact language of the question that you stated back here in part 1. Whether seminary students should study systematic theology, you want your objections to use that exact language. Don't change this all of a sudden to something else. You want to use the exact same wording that you did in the question. So when you're doing part 2, you'll state 3. Now you can state more, but I'm going to require at least 3 objections, the most important objections to your thesis, in the form of a hypothetical syllogism. And the conclusion of every one of those syllogisms will be contrary to your thesis. Now, to state your thesis, you will again use the exact language of the question in part 1 and the conclusion of each syllogism in part 2, and you will state that by saying, on the contrary. And that is, of course, on the contrary to everything you said in part 2. On the contrary, seminary students should study systematic theology. Now, this means, from this wording right here, I can conclude that the conclusion to every one of the objections that I listed in part 2, the conclusion to each one of those syllogisms will be that seminary students should not study systematic theology. Again, it's important to preserve the exact wording. Part 4 is quite straightforward. Just write 3 to 4 paragraphs then in prose format defending your thesis. Now in part 5, this is very important because all those objections you listed in part 2, you need to go back now and refute those. If any of those objections stand, in other words, if you can't refute them, then that means you need to change your thesis. again, we're striving after the truth here. We're not just trying to win an argument or a victory. We're trying to find the truth. And if any of those objections stands, then you need to change your thesis. However, if you thought through this carefully and you know how to refute each one of those objections, then you will do so in Part 5. Now, when you refute those objections, you have to do it in a very precise way. You need to go to those syllogisms and dispute or deny either the major or the minor premise of each syllogism. That's how this works in logic. You look at the syllogism and you look at the major premise or the minor premise. Now, you will agree with one of the premises. One of the premises you will find that you agree with. You'll say, yes, that is correct. However, one of the premises, either the major or the minor premise, you will disagree with, and you will dispute that. So in Part 5 of your objection, where you're refuting these objections, you will state that. You will say, I dispute or I deny the major or the minor premise. And then you will summon evidence in a little paragraph, a brief paragraph after that denial, where you will summon the evidence that supports your assertion. Let me give you an example of this. You'll remember that the syllogism was this right here. If systematic theology forces a student into error, then seminary students should, actually this should be, should not study. I forgot, I left the word not out there, sorry. Should not study systematic theology. Systematic theology forces a student into error. You can see I affirmed the antecedent there. And again, I left out the word not. Therefore, seminary students should not study systematic theology. Now, if I come here and I look at this, I want to, in Part 5, refute that syllogism, then I'm going to say, I dispute or I deny the minor premise. Now, this right here is the minor premise. So now I'm going to write a little paragraph after that where I do exactly that. Many students who have studied systematic theology have not gone into error. And then I'm going to write a paragraph defending that. So there's an example of disputing the minor premise. How about disputing the major premise? Again, here's my syllogism, and again, I apologize, I left out the word not. It should say students should not study systematic theology, therefore seminary students should not, right here, study systematic theology. And here, I dispute the major premise, where I'm going to say it is true that many students are forced into error. In other words, I grant the truth that this systematic theology does force a student into error. So I agree with the minor premise. But I don't agree with the major premise that therefore students shouldn't study systematic theology. So you can see what I state here. It is true that many students are forced into error by studying systematic theology. But that is no reason for them to avoid the subject entirely, and on and so forth. I will defend that argument. So that is Part 5 of a scholastic essay. And altogether then, that is a complete scholastic essay. And what this essay does is it forces you to think logically about the subject that you've chosen. It forces you to state your terms very clearly, and it forces you to understand the argument, and especially to understand the arguments that are made against your position, and to refute each one of those effectively. And again, it's very important to remember that in all cases, we're aiming for the truth. We're searching for truth regardless of the consequences.